In the previous desktop delve, you heard that the late 90s was the beginning of the end for the common desktop environment. The many different Unixes were fragmented during the great dawn of the graphical user interface, and by the time the standard, CDE, was chosen, favor had already begun to wane. Add that to the exorbitant licensing costs in one hand, and the Free Software Foundation's GNU general public licenses gaining popularity in the other, and what you ended up with was a situation ripe for disruption. Sure, there were window managers and a tile here and there, but nothing that would truly rival CDE in completeness. And remember, Linux, the kernel, was still young, being only 5 years old in 1996, as we ease into the story, and full distributions were even younger. The Unixes were beset on all sides by major corporate players like Windows 95, Mac OS 7, and OS 2 Warp 4, all with developed user interfaces. Not to mention NextStep, which would be acquired by Apple, that would become the basis of later macOS versions. The personal computer was here, and Linux needed something. At the end of 1996, Matthias Ettrich was already working on getting KDE off the ground, but had not seen a real release yet, and it'd be another year before Miguel de Icaza would start work on GNOME. But there was another option, nestled in between the well-known names. Olivier Fourdan, having had lots of experience with CDE in his day job, and even more experience with Linux by night, wanted something similar for his tinkerings. The panel and drawer paradigm especially, as he felt the alternative, the start menu approach in Windows, was too convoluted. In early 1997, with 3 years of Linux experience under his belt, but none in X11 programming, Olivier got his hands on a copy of both XForms and Fdesign, which, in just a few weeks, allowed for the creation of XFCE, or the XForms Common Environment. The X and F are capitalized to match XForms. This was 1.0. It would closely follow CDE's panel approach. So much so, in fact, that Olivier posted a question to a few newsgroups.
Hello, I've written a toolbar for X11 under Linux that looks like the CDE panel. The icons are not exactly the same, I've redrawn them, but they're designed to look like the originals. I do not mention the name of CDE, and I do not use any part of CDE nor motif. XFCE, that's its name, is not a clone of CDE. It's just a toolbar with 3D widgets, pull-down menus, and color icons. Do I have the right to freely distribute my program?
Now, at this time, it wasn't the full desktop environment we know today. It was only the CDE-like panel that could be used on top of FVWM, one of the most popular window managers at the time. Over the next few months, XFCE gained better integration with FVWM, but in 1998, as XFCE was maturing, FVWM was left behind in favor of the homegrown XFWM, which led to the release of XFCE 2.0, the cholesterol-free desktop. Dubbed such because, at the time, cholesterol-free diets were all the rage, and XFCE was nothing if not lightweight. With the addition of a silly moniker, but mostly the pace of development, the desktop environment was finally starting to come into its own. Success was really happening, and to commemorate that, Chuck Mead of Moon Group Consulting had reached out in an attempt to make XFCE a little more official by helping Olivier acquire xfce.org and a website to sit on top. Prior to this, communication was done via newsgroups and email, and distribution was done over FTP. While the site helped with publicity and communication, there was a problem brewing deep within the core of Xfce. XForms, the toolkit used to create the desktop, was free to use for free applications and in private use, but under no circumstances was source code made available. This meant that the dominant distributions at the time, like Debian, Red Hat, and Slackware, shunned inclusion of Xfce in their main repositories. Luckily, those distributions didn't outright refuse, but Xfce was relegated to the less than official contributor repositories, which made the desktop available only to those that wanted to enable it. This, obviously, didn't sit well with Olivier. So, as any good desktop developer in the open source world would do, he initiated a full rewrite of Xfce using the GNU Image Manipulation Programs Toolkit, or as most know it today, simply GTK. In July of 1999, after 4 months of development, the third major iteration of the desktop was officially released. It still had much of the same look and feel of CDE, and while it was already cholesterol-free, now it was XForms-free as well, and licensed fully under the GPL. GTK Plus underpins the entire project and brought with it the up till then elusive drag and drop. And the project itself leaned even harder into modularity. Olivier wrote in the announce message,
Xfce is an easy-to-use and easy-to-configure environment for X11 based on GTK+, with pull-down menus and color icons, 3D widgets, etc. Xfce features now a set of applications including a powerful window manager, XFWM, a toolbar application launcher, a backdrop manager, a system sound manager for X11, a user-friendly interface for mouse configuration, a pager providing a miniature view of all Xfce desktops, a clock calendar, and at last but not least, a file manager, all sharing the same look and feel.
To drive the modularity point home, Olivier also notes in an interview with Linux Orbit,
You don't need GNOME compatibility. Fine. Unselect the corresponding module from Xfce setup panel and it won't start, saving a few kilobytes. Same for the sound, backdrops, etc. You can even choose to run XFWM without the Xfce panel.
Version 3 development also brought in file management, native language support, and up to 10 virtual screens among a slew of other features, some of which were firsts for the Linux desktop. The series continued on with 3.1 and 3.2 releasing in 1999 and 3.3 through 3.6 releasing in 2000. Around October of 2000, it was decided that no project is complete without a logo that represents the project well. So Chuck Mead, always eager to help, and knowing artists that did this type of work, had Bonnie Green provide a few logos for Olivier to choose from. Of those, he found a perfect fit. A mouse in front of a bluish-gray letter X with the letters Xfce along the bottom. Olivier said,
The mouse is a good symbol for Xfce. It's a small animal, smart and fast. The X can be seen as the X window symbol, so the whole logo symbolizes a fast, light environment for X.
In January of 2001, 3.7.0 was released, and in April, 3.8.0. But in this most recent release, something changed. The CDE panel paradigm was still there, but the look and feel was different. A more metallic look washed over the desktop, enabled by XFWM's newly minted themes engine. A little shocking if you were expecting the tried and true style. But as with everything else in Xfce, it's configurable. 3.8.0's development continued on throughout the rest of 2001 and into 2002. But around November, early testing versions of Xfce4 were coming online, and focus had shifted to developing for the next generation of Xfce, which would be completely rewritten for GTK2. The last official release of the 3 series, 3.8.18, helped the series ride off into the sunset. And it was about this time that Slackware, one of the first major distributions to do so, officially included Xfce in version 8.1. During the latter half of 2003, the Xfce4 development had almost reached its conclusion with betas in June, release candidates in June, July, August, and September, and on September 25th, Xfce 4.0 was finally released as a result of more than a year's worth of development. But for those that weren't ready, or simply liked both, the Xfce 3 series could be installed alongside. 4.0 still had the essence of CDE baked into the bottom panel, but it most certainly had an identity all its own. In part thanks to the themability of the desktop, but also because of its innate ability for customization of almost everything under the hood. Up until now, it was written such that the XF in Xfce was capitalized, while the CE was not. In the 4.0.3.1 minor release in January of 2004, this all changed, quietly and with no fanfare. The F shrunk. The X is the only capitalized letter left in the name, signifying that XF no longer stands for XForms. But those familiar with the project understood this since version 3. For the next few big releases in the 4 series, there seemed to be a natural cadence to it all, because a little less than 2 years later, 4.2.0 was released, which brought in some visual enhancements like drop shadows and transparency. About 2 years after that, 4.4.0 was released, which brought the venerable Thunar file manager, which is still the default manager today. It also dropped the last of its CDE feel and opted for a more traditional panel at the bottom. 2 years after that, 4.6.0 was released with a new settings manager, sound mixer, and many core component improvements. 2 years after that, 4.8.0 was released with network share browsers and a rewritten panel. 4.10.0 began to break the cycle by releasing a little over a year later in 2012. But the focus had changed. The release was mostly concerned with the user experience, but could also now display the panel vertically. 4.12.0 continued the trend by releasing almost 3 years later. Still focusing on the user experience, it also included high DPI support, better multi-monitor support, and the beginnings of GTK3 support by adding compatibility to the panel. Every project has a long winter, and it was time for Xfce to have theirs, but for good reason. GTK2 was long in the tooth and had to be replaced. It was 10 years old at this point, and GTK3 had been going for quite some time. By 2016, the GTK3 final release would be out, which didn't quite happen, and focus would be on GTK4, with a note that once it was released, GTK2 would be end of life. The clock was ticking. It took over 4 years of development work, but with renewed hope, on August 12th, 2019, Xfce was out from under GTK2 with version 4.14 and was ready to start life again for the 4th time. But unless you popped the hood or dug into the minute details, it was hard to tell. Xfce had long since defined its reputation as nothing short of stable, solid, and reliable. Looking back, Xfce had always taken the when it's ready approach, and this release was no different, nor would any release be ahead of us. Under a year and a half later, 4.16 was released with a renewed focus on the user-facing elements, a new, pleasing, and consistent icon set, a shared core application color palette, dark mode, better search filter support, and a laundry list of other fixes and improvements. And we finally arrive at the last, at least as of now, release of Xfce, as we haven't quite figured out how to peer into the future. 4.18 was released after a little under 2 years in development, bringing with it a list of changes that might take up a good chunk of time. Suffice it to say, image previews and toolbar configuration in Thunar, better file highlighting, and improved UI scaling landed in this version. We're likely a little ways out before a 4.20 release goes up in smoke, but we're excited to see the changes, or maybe just the improvements to the desktop when it lands, man.
You can catch all the great topics as they unfold on our Lemmy subreddit or our news channel on Discord. I mean, we got all the great stuff that happens there, although we've been a little tied up with the Xfce history here as of late, so we might be just a little bit behind on the current news, but we tend to get them out there in Lemmy and the Reddit and Discord pretty quick.
They come in bulk. When all the news hits you in the face at once, you know we're working on the history.
Yeah.
Because, focus changes just a little bit when stuff's coming together.
Yep. So, no, you can check all of that stuff, linuxuserspace.show/Lemmy, Reddit, Discord, and of course we've got Mastodon and Telegram and Matrix and Twitch and Twitter too. And if you ever need to find them, just go to linuxuserspace.show.